Well, hello everyone. My name is Michel. Thank you very much for joining us today. For those who are not familiar with No Silver Bullet, our name reflects a simple fact. There is currently no single silver bullet for Parkinson's. Instead, we advocate for a holistic approach addressing the condition from every angle: medical, physical, nutritional, mental, and technological. So we often discuss exercise or diet in isolation, but our guest research highlights a powerful synergistic, i.e. multiplier effect between those various components. So by combining targeted exercise, nutrition, and stress management, we can create a neuroprotective environment that supports both mitochondrial function and reduces inflammation. So I'm delighted to host Professor Joanne Trinh from the Institute of Neurogenetics in Lübeck, Germany, where she heads a research group that investigates how genetics interact with environmental factors and lifestyle choices like diet or exercise. She recently published a fascinating piece of research, really, you have to have a look at that, in the Lancet, exploring how lifestyle modifications can influence the age of onset, and importantly for us who already have Parkinson's, the long-term trajectory of the disease. So before we start, as you all know, I would like to remind everyone that this session is for information and education purposes only. So if you're seeking medical advice, please make sure that you consult a medical professional. And there will be time, as always, for questions at the end of the presentation. And if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So Joanne, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to our community today. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Michel. And I'm very happy to be here. So today, the talk that I have is entitled The Parkinson's Lifestyle Plan, Bridging Global Research and Personal Action. So as Michel already mentioned, I'm a Heisenberg Professor of Neurogenomics, actually at the Institute of Neurogenetics, University of Lübeck. And since not many of you probably know who I am, I wanted to start with a short introduction of the research group that I'm leading at the University of Lübeck. So it's called Integrative Omics in Parkinson's Disease. And first of all, we're located actually in the north of Germany. For those of you who don't know where Lübeck is, it's quite close to Copenhagen, and it's very famous for its marzipan, actually. So I'm actually a trained geneticist, and I originally come from Canada, not from Germany, from Vancouver, the Pacific Coast. And currently, my team investigates lifestyle environmental factors, which I will go over in terms of our research and what there is out there for Parkinson's disease. We look into genetics and molecular biology and how the lifestyle environmental factors influence that. We try to combine the two together. And the important research question we're diving into is why some people with Parkinson's disease have, earlier age at onset and some have later age at onset, and what makes that happen, or what is rather protective for individuals. And our research group is funded by the German Research Foundation, as well as intramural funds from the university. So very grateful for that. We're involved in several different consortia, and this includes the Global Parkinson's Genetics Program. This is actually led by Andy Singleton and Cornelis Blauendrath. We're very grateful to be a strong hub within the monogenic network for genetics of Parkinson's. And this is led by our director here at the Institute, Professor Christine Klein. I wanted to also bring the attention to a book that we recently wrote with several colleagues. And one chapter within this book is on gene-environment interactions and behavior. And this is written by, this chapter particularly by a postdoc in the group, Dr. Carolyn Gabbard. And she co-wrote this with Professor Micah Casson from epidemiology. So we have both the genetics and the epidemiology of Parkinson's disease within this chapter to really show and get a better insight of how these two interfaces interact. So for today's agenda, we'll start with the general introduction and dive into sort of physical activity, stress, diet, other lifestyle choices or exposures and interactions or mechanisms, and then finally the conclusion. As most of the viewers here already know, Parkinson's disease is very complex, very heterogeneous, And there's variations in age at onset and the progression, the presentation of the disease, treatment responses, and the underlying pathophysiology. And there isn't just a single mutation that causes PD, even though there are single mutations that exist. It's very complex. Even with that, you have variations of age at onset, you have variations of progression. So we suggest, like what Michel has already alluded to, this holistic approach in addition to conventional management. And here within this talk, I describe these lifestyle interventions that can reduce disability and improve the quality of life. So we recently published this paper called The Role of Lifestyle Interventions in Symptom Management and Disease Modification in Parkinson's disease. And this review in the Lancet was written with Ninka, who was my co-first author, and then the writing group included Rick and Bas as senior authors, and Bill and Marika, they incorporated a cultural diversity aspect of these lifestyle interventions that we reviewed. So I'll be deeply going into the results that we see in the literature and what we have shown in our paper. So what do we mean by sort of lifestyle interventions? The therapies focusing on lifestyle factors to prevent, manage, or reverse chronic conditions. This is how we define this. And we took from the foundations of lifestyle medicine and its evolution, we took the 6 pillars of health. And this includes nutrition, physical activity, we have managing stress, relationships and social connection, sleep, and avoiding risky substances. We didn't review every single pillar within this article, but we focused specifically on physical activity, managing stress and nutrition, along with the synergistic effects of these lifestyle interventions. So, of course, I wanted to start with sort of aligning these lifestyle interventions for patients. And this can definitely be difficult. And here I'm showing a schematic that is what we have in the paper called a vicious cycle or virtuous cycle. It's outlining or trying to outline the patient's struggles with the 6 pillars of these lifestyle interventions. As PD is characterized by very complex sort of motor and non-motor features, and both sets of these symptoms really interfere with the person's ability to engage in a healthy lifestyle. For example, you have gait disability or postural instability, and then that can increase the fear of falling. And then that in turn sort of prevents an individual from remaining physically active because they have this idea that they might the fear of falling, they might be falling, or there could be some adverse effects of this. Now, then it compounds with the inability to exercise because of fatigue, and then there are difficulties of that due to maybe depression or apathy that can happen. In addition, there might be swallowing difficulties involved in the disease in the non-motor features, hyposmia, and fear of bloating, as well as other aspects that can lead to a suboptimal diet for patients. And then these symptoms can result in an unhealthy lifestyle and further symptomatic worsening, thus completing this vicious cycle. And then hastening that with underlying sort of disease progression and further accelerating this cycle. And then in panel B, on the other hand, we're trying to show that there are many opportunities to break such a cycle. And this is so-called the virtuous cycle, where an individual can perhaps introduce as a first step, conventional medical management that could help with the symptoms, and then improve further with an addition of a lifestyle intervention that they can adhere to, that is something that's attainable. And then being able to then have symptoms improving, and then creating further opportunities to enhance this intensity of the first intervention, for example, or take additional lifestyle interventions, and thus breaking the cycle. Within this review, we looked at evidence in the past 5 years. We looked at synergistic effects of combining different lifestyle interventions. And we don't explicitly review the lifestyle domain of social interactions, although there are, of course, aspects of social interactions in, for example, community-based approaches, or in certain approaches that might also tie into the lifestyle interventions that we discuss. And we provide recommendations and grading of these specific lifestyle interventions and focus on randomized controlled trials here. So diving into the specifics of the lifestyle interventions, this includes physical activity, nutrition, and stress. I'm going to start with physical activity first. So formally, we define this as any body movement produced by skeletal muscles that requires energy. It's a very broad concept. So you have exercise that can be planned, it can be structured, repetitive bodily movements. That's categorized into sort of aerobic exercise, so something that's rhythmic, repetitive, increases heart rate, like cycling, rowing, running. You have resistance training, repetitively contracting the muscles against resistance, flexibility exercise, neuromotor exercises. You can also have unplanned and unstructured activities involved in physical activity, like walking or household tasks, or some leisure activities like dancing, for example, walking the dog, for example, as considered physical activity. And with that, what does the literature show? So what we have discovered through the past 5 years is that their moderate to high intensity aerobic exercise stabilizes motor symptoms over a 6-month period. Light to moderate physical activity is also beneficial. Combining sort of aerobic exercise with resistance training might provide synergistic benefits. And right now, HIIT workouts have yet to show consistent effects. And then exergaming, which is something that is relatively new, showed that there was this one study where there were fewer people who had falls, and in those who fell, a lower number of falls. And on the right side here, you can see several different research reports and RCTs that we have included, corresponding to what our conclusions were. But I'm going to dive deeper into sort of the first one to show what an RCT looks like and what the different groups actually give information to. So in this study, it's about brisk walking by Michel, where they actually started with 154 participants, of which they excluded several, and ended up with 70 participants to randomize. So you have, out of the 70, quite even groups of the brisk walkers and the control group, which is not doing brisk walking, but rather upper limb training. And they measured the completion of this training at the 6-week period and then at the 6-month period. There were several dropouts in between or some issues. However, the group sizes still remained over 30. And what we're seeing here is that for the results post 6-week compared to the pre-6-week is that there are already differences in the MDS-UPDRS motor score. There are already differences in the 6-minute walking distance, also this mini best score, or the FGS, the fast gait speed, or the timed up and go score. So there's several different scores to measure motor levels, and then you would have that compared between the brisk walkers and the controls. And you do see the differences already at 6 weeks. And then when it comes to 6 months, these differences are even further exacerbated. So you can see that there are definite changes in the motor scores and also the accompanied secondary outcomes, these functional mobility scores. So this paper shows that, with the RCTs here, that moderate physical activity can actually be beneficial for patients already. And this is one example. And how does that affect the brain or or turn that into sort of better motor scores. How does exercise do that? And there's a study by Bas and Rick and Ninka, who are my co-authors here, that show that aerobic exercise has actually led to improved cognitive control and reduce global brain atrophy. So there's a component in there where you can exercise, and that actually directly influences brain function and brain structure. In addition to that, molecularly speaking, there was an interesting paper that was published on how exercise boosts memory and dampens the brain inflammation. So this is via a pathway called clusterin in the complement pathway. And you might want to also dive into the publication by Boss, where they write a commentary on this, how this complement system and clustering actually molecularly gives a biological difference in the brain. Now, some adverse effects could be of concern when doing physical activity for patients, and here I'm listing two of them. One is cardiovascular disease, where, but however, there's no study that we've seen in the past 5 years having an adverse effect there for any cardiovascular effects. And then there are falls that can have serious consequences. However, we also did not see any studies with increased falls delivered because, well, all of the studies that we have with the RCTs were under supervised conditions. So that's one aspect to keep in mind when doing exercises. And these are several studies here that I'm showing from Van der Kolk et al. In the Lancet Neurology, where they see that there's the effectiveness of home-based and remotely supervised aerobic exercise in PD, and they don't see any adverse effects with falls or cardiovascular diseases. And then a recent study just published in February this year by Ninka's group and Bas also involved, is the relationship between falls and physical activity and daily life of people with Parkinson's. And they also don't see a significant increase in persons who perform supervised activities. So the next, moving on to the nutrition aspects. So this includes sort of macronutrient intake, so calorie intake, dietary patterns, and use of supplements. Although in our study, in our review here, we have actually moved the supplements and the discussion to the appendix because we wanted to focus more in the text on other diets outside of supplements. But I will discuss this today. What does the literature show? Actually, from the 21 studies, 17 studies were on supplements in the past 5 years for RCTs. But most of these studies were very small in sample sizes, and the interventions themselves and the diet were very brief. And now the interventions and outcomes were also very heterogeneous. It's very difficult to draw overall conclusions out of the literature for nutrition. But Mediterranean diet, as many of you know, that is protective against PD risk, and that has been shown in the past in epidemiological studies, as well as several Mendelian randomization studies too. And here, for the past 5 years, Mediterranean diet is feasible, and it might positively affect cognition and constipation. And the ketogenic diet, what we've seen so far, showed no consistent improvement in motor, non-motor symptoms, and it seemed to be difficult to adhere to. So for the Mediterranean diet, this was published by Rouche et al., where you do see in this RCT that people have better constipation symptoms and alters that. We see that there's an effect of the Mediterranean diet on cognitive function here in this RCT by Pagnahad et al. And this randomized feasibility of the ketogenic diet was actually looked at, and within this, they did not see any significant improvement in the motor features. And as for supplements, what kind of supplements have been studied? We saw there are probiotics, prebiotics, nicotinamide riboside, vitamin B3, vitamin D, omegas, and melatonin. There are others outside of these supplements like prebiotics, etc., that are more Chinese traditional medicine, like Da Ding Feng Zhu or Pingshan granule or Mucuna pruriens, which actually contain L-DOPA, precursor uh, to dopamine, and people have used this even in certain countries as a substitute for L-DOPA. But how does it work? We actually say that all of these require replication and further studies on its effects. So although there are some studies that have looked at these, many of them require a separate independent study to really confirm their effects. So what we saw is that melatonin supplementation actually helped with improved sleep and other non-motor symptoms. There's a mixture of omega-3, omega-6, vitamin A, vitamin E, and tocopherol with a 30-month follow-up and found a positive effect on motor symptoms. And then probiotics have a positive effect on constipation and gut microbiota. And this mucuna pruriens affected the effectiveness of this in terms of dopamine might be hampered by tolerability issues. So there could be GI symptoms or worsening of motor performance in people with advanced Parkinson's disease. So you might be a bit cautious for that. And these traditional Chinese medicines have mixed results in the literature so far. Some of the concerns regarding nutrition come up, for example, like malnutrition, not having enough of certain groups, or there's also concern about protein intake, where where protein has been said to interfere with the L-DOPA response or the uptake of L-DOPA. And here I'm showing an RCT that describes using protein supplementation in patients without interfering with L-DOPA. And several studies have shown this as well. And as well, long-term effectiveness and potential to modify disease progression. Using this is hampered, really using diet is hampered by challenges related to adherence. And of course, as for lifestyle and diets, you can adhere to it a certain time, but having that as a long-term solution might be quite tricky and quite difficult. And motivation to change diet is also another difficult aspect to think about and to consider. So next comes stress. And stress management. So of course, people can experience a variety of stress in their day-to-day lives. You have what we formally define as environmental demands, these stressors, and it exceeds an individual's capacity and it results in or adaptive capacity, sorry, and it results in psychological and sort of physiological responses. In this case, for example, we have the HPA axis that can be activated during stressful situations, and this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It results in cortisol release, and this cortisol release can also cause this chronic stress exposure and psychological symptoms or anxiety and depression. So whether or not an individual develops these symptoms depends on resilience factors, several factors, including cognitive appraisal and of the stressor and coping mechanisms yourself, some cognitive mechanisms and social support. In our review, we actually looked into sort of the non-pharmacological ways of reducing stress. And this includes mind-body exercises, mindfulness, yoga, tai chi, qigong, and ways to manage stress. Mindfulness-based interventions with had consistent beneficial effects on stress. There was a study on an 18-month meditation training, which improved a global composite score. We had social isolation being a high risk for Parkinson's disease. And then social support being related to better cognitive abilities and positive appraisal and associated with better resilience. And here are some of the studies that I'm showing, one by Kwok et al. On mindfulness, yoga, and stretching combined with resistance training on anxiety and depression that really showed that there was benefit to that in terms of an individual's state of anxiety or depression or mood. And then we have an effect of this 18-month meditation training in JAMA neurology, where it shows that there are regional brain volume differences as well as improvement in the score for daily life. And then there's a randomized clinical trial for mindfulness meditation versus exercise. And together, all of this really points towards the fact that you can combine several of these different stress management tools, if you will, and exercises to be able to help with your mood and your cognitive abilities, etc. And taken together with all these three different factors that we've looked very deeply into, we actually created a recommendation for readers and a clinical practice table. Some of these are authors' opinions, so our opinion, but quite a few are actually scored within these Oxford Center for Evidence-Based Medicine in different levels of evidence, including very high levels, level 1, with many individual RCTs showing the same results or same direction. And then level 5 being our expert opinion without explicit critical appraisal, or it's based on physiology or first principles. And for example, for physical activity, we recommend doing aerobic exercise at least 3 times per week for at least 30 minutes. If possible, strive for a high intensity. Although moderate intensity is also better than no exercise. So this, we had a high level of evidence there. And then doing resistance training for large muscle groups of 1 repetition maximum, also quite high in the level. And consider flexibility and neuromotor physical activities, balance or agility training. Increase volume of daily activities. This is an author's opinion. Ideally used in addition to aerobic exercises. And then considered adverse effects, which includes the cardiovascular risk or falls. And then in this case, please have a specialized physiotherapist or sports trainer for guidance. As for nutrition, it's very difficult to have a conclusive piece of evidence for each of these dietary patterns, although there's evidence that suggests the benefit of Mediterranean diet. There's evidence for certain supplements that could be recommended, vitamin C, vitamin K, some antioxidants. The general dietary patterns should be followed as well. So considering adequate amounts of these macronutrients, for example, with small amounts of highly processed foods. There's dietary pattern using probiotics or diet high in fiber or both seems beneficial for constipation. And then weight should be monitored, which this part is actually our own opinion. And also fluid intake should be monitored to reduce constipation as well. And also possible adverse effects, including urinary frequency and nocturia. This is also our opinion. With the stress management, we have mindfulness-based interventions as a recommendation, weekly group sessions, or during an 8-week period, effective for reducing stress levels. And then we have mindfulness-based interventions improving motor symptoms, but pooled evidence across 7 randomized control trials we looked at did not find significant effect. So there's some conflicting evidence with the motor symptoms with mindfulness. And the long-term effects of mindfulness-based interventions on stress-related symptoms are unclear. However, you do see that effect rather in a shorter period. And then there's interpersonal relations and social support, likely effective in promoting stress resilience. This is something that we didn't go over in a lot of detail, but this is very important as well. So we had a level 2 for that. And then yoga could be effective in reducing stress-related symptoms like anxiety, but not all evidence points in the same direction. So I also wanted to go over other lifestyle choices or exposures here besides the ones that are covered in the review. And one example that I wanted to give is from our lab, and this is Dr. Carolyn Gabbard. I mentioned her earlier during the talk. She published a paper on aspirin, where one aspect of many that she's published, whether or not there's an impact of aspirin on Parkinson's, and she sees that aspirin takers have a delayed age of onset and is associated with the duration and also the amount of aspirin taken. And we also looked into a separate cohort. So this is one cohort, the panel ABC, and then in panel D, there's a separate cohort we looked at because we were wondering if this actually withstands replication. So in a separate cohort, the same protective effect actually shows for age at onset, which is interesting. But then we asked a question, and she published this in a separate paper in Scientific Reports, whether or not this aspirin intake, when somebody has Parkinson's already, is it correlated with better improvement of the disease, right? And unfortunately, what we found was it's correlated with more tremor and problems getting up, lightheadedness, and problems remembering. So there is actually, even though it shows to be protective for age at onset, there still is an issue when it comes to motor severity. And in addition, and also non-motor severity. And she also found that smoking was associated with symptoms such as problems with drooling, swallowing, and freezing. She also has found that there were problems with depression and anxiety as well. So it's interesting that there could be different effects to the same factor. And then outside of lifestyle, we have exposures in the environment that could be harmful. So here, Dr. Teresa Lute, who's another postdoc in the group, she investigated pesticides exposures in a longitudinal fashion using severity scores like MDS-UPDRS Part 2. And what she sees is that across time, here we have longitudinal exposures, different time points from time point 1 to time point 6, and PPMI was across several years. What she found was that people who were exposed to pesticides have a worsening of this symptom, and even across, compared to people who were not exposed to pesticides. This is in the PPMI cohort. And in a separate cohort, with Fox Insight cohort, she sees the very same thing, where people who are exposed have a higher Part 2 score, so worsening of the symptoms compared to people without the exposure. And then on the other hand, the flip side, when we're looking at black tea, we see a different effect. So here, with LRRK2 PD, LRRK2 is actually one of the genes for Parkinson's, where there's a variant in LRRK2 that is causal for PD and is the most common genetic form. So she looked at the most common genetic form, and what she found was that with the black teas, the opposite effect is associated with less severe motor aspects and across time. So you have, the red is no black tea, and then yes, being black tea drinkers. So that's actually quite interesting to see the differences here. And are there any interactions, we asked, of the different lifestyle choices taken together? So Carolyn put together several factors that were available in a large set, so thousands of individuals looking at if they drink coffee, if they're smokers, if they take aspirin, and whether or not that influences age at onset. And if you had all three, it pushes the age at onset back. So here you have these curves called cumulative incidence curves. And the black line represents, okay, someone who has all three factors, and then 0 with none of these factors. And you can tell that the curves actually are pushed a bit backwards, meaning the age at onset is later. So there are these additive effects, if you have one of these factors versus 2 versus 3. And that leads me back to the paper where we're describing the examples of these interventions and how they're related in multiple ways. So, for example, if you're boxing in a group, it can be related to stress. It can be related to restorative sleep or exercise domain or social connection. When you're eating a Mediterranean diet, it can affect nutrition, but also it can affect social connection as well when you're with other people eating the diet, or other along with probably stress or mindfulness and yoga related to stress, related to exercise, also related to social connection. So there are several different lifestyle domains that can occur, and then that could concurrently and additively create these synergistic mechanisms of action. And that allows us to come to a clinical outcome of fitness or bone health, or PD-specific outcomes like motor function and non-motor function, and other comorbidities outside of PD. So Alzheimer's disease or cardiovascular disease is affected, and possible disease modification. And what are the underlying mechanisms biologically we want to understand, and we want to know what do these lifestyle interventions actually affect, or what can you do to help influence these mechanisms. So in the center of the circle, we have inflammation. We have lower inflammation, increased immunity, decreased oxidative stress, increased mitochondrial function, and decreased cerebral vascular disease, and changes of epigenetics, whether or not it's one or the other. And then in turn, because of these benefits, we decrease neurodegeneration, increase neuroplasticity. But how do we influence these specific aspects? Then we have a certain layer beneath that, right, where we have decreased cortisol, right, increased short-chain fatty acids by increasing the diversity of your microbiome, for example, increase VO2 max, or several different aspects. And how do we influence those aspects? By your lifestyle, so physical activity, or nutrition here, or stress management, for example. So these are this sort of scheme is to really suggest that there is control over certain mechanisms in your body and related to brain function. And several interactions, of course, from my team is also on genes and genetics. And I discussed LRRK2, where there's this common genetic form, common monogenic form in PD that's related to lifestyle factors, and being able to look into how black tea drinking or tobacco use can also influence this genetic form. So not just influences PD, idiopathic PD, but also these specific genetic forms as well. And what we're doing in the lab, and this is with Dr. Philip Zeibler in collaboration, and Megan is the PhD student running this, and Susie is the technician for all of the genetic studies, is we're trying to look at what's the mechanism, what's the causal mechanism. When we have neurons, we have these cell types from patients. We take patients' skin cells and we create these neurons, and then we treat the neurons with, for example, inflammation signals or pesticides exposure, rotenone, or any of these sorts of external exposures. And then we look at physiologically what happens in these cells and in these models to be able to understand exactly the mechanistic reasons why this occurs. So this is currently ongoing. And in conclusion, what we have actually this month, several correspondences and replies have been submitted to Lancet, and we've replied to this, and very interesting. So Dr. Ali Butbut from the Philippines, they wrote about how there are these lifestyle interventions with economic barriers, and they have community programs and community-based lifestyle interventions in the Philippines that could really help with peer support activities and stress education, which was really insightful. And Dr. Kalba and Schaefer, they told us that we should really look more into cognitive impairment and draw attention to cognition and how lifestyle intervention actually helps with cognitive impairment, with having a very, very high impact, and it's urgently needed, specifically for chronic diseases. And then Dr. Tan from Singapore wrote about the exposome in Parkinson's and having several exposures that can jointly be in one score, for example, so that we can quantify these exposures and these lifestyle factors better. So in conclusion, large-scale, long-term clinical trials focused on sustainable behavioral changes and addressing adherence is very important. We have discussed patients with Parkinson's disease, but different stages of patients, patients of different stages, whether it's more severe or less severe, or even prodromal stages, we should really look into all these different aspects. I didn't discuss this too much, but gamification. So these strategies, in order for us to change our behavior to really help with with adhering to the lifestyle interventions is important. And the mechanism of action, trying to understand what is the disease modifying effect and optimizing those symptomatic effects, and trying to understand that is something of interest, as well as disease progression markers or metabolic changes or digital markers and microbiome or imaging markers to help better evaluate the biological effects. And now we have such advances in multi-omics approaches applied to the brains would be ideal to observe these direct exposures or lifestyle interventions. So with that, I would really like to acknowledge the writers of the review, Bas Bloom supervising the whole project, and Ninka and Rick really helping with the writing of the stress management as well as the nutrition and the physical activity aspects. I would like to thank the Institute of Neurogenetics and our director, Christine. My research group, I mentioned our collaborator Philip with the Institute, and Megan, Susie, Teresa, and Carolyn's work, as well as all the other team members and the research funding that we're receiving at the Institute. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne, for a very interesting presentation. Actually, looking at the last slide, I can say that Bastian Blum has been speaking to us on a couple of occasions in the past about exercise and nutrition. So those webinars are on our YouTube channel. We had the pleasure of having Rick Helmish twice as well. Once to talk about stress a couple of years ago, and more recently, a few months ago, he spoke to us about brain plasticity. And then we had Professor Christine Klein, I think last year, on genetics. So we don't know everyone on this slide, but we have quite a few contacts already.
That's great, yeah.
And people who want to dig further on the topic can look at our YouTube channel. So thank you very much. I'm particularly interested in the fact that you include pillars that we don't talk so often about. We speak a lot about exercise, about nutrition, not so often about relaxation and meditation and social engagement. Those are topics, especially the last one, that are more difficult perhaps to scientifically analyze. But I remember that actually Rick Helmish presented some charts on his presentation about stress, showing the impact of meditation, the positive impact of meditation on people who are practicing it, and a very high level of recommendation. I think more than 90%, 95% of people who practice meditation and have Parkinson's were recommending it to others. So I think this is really, really hitting all the right nails. And actually, for a group like No Silver Bullet, this is exactly what we advocate. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
One thing you were mentioning as well is that it is, of course, difficult for anyone to keep the discipline of multiple years of practicing exercise regularly, of eating the way we should, of meditating the way we think we should. And I wanted to mention our partners at PD Buddy. The application PD Buddy helps you along the way to maintain your routine and to use gamification to play around if you want to be scored for your adherence to your routine and to get points that you can compare to other people with Parkinson's on the app. So it's quite fun. There's a lot of research. Have a look at PD Buddy if you want. So thank you for that. Let's just, oh yeah, and the last thing I want to say before I forget, on the 7th of May, we will have the pleasure of a presentation by Lüdi Shi, sorry, from Harvard Medical School. She'll be talking to us about Parkinson's and aging. It would be interesting as well, because of course, there comes a point where the symptoms that we undergo, that we feel in our bodies might be aging as well as Parkinson's, or a combination of both. So stay tuned for that. Let's just look at the questions that have come up as we were talking.
Should I stop sharing the screen?
Yes, please, if you don't mind. That's a very good point. So Heribert is asking about physical activity, is mentioned in terms of frequency. What about the duration of those physical activities? Do you have any guidance as to how long people should exercise for?
Yeah, so we have this this recommendation table where we have scored it based on the clinical practice from Oxford Center of Evidence-Based Medicine. What we say for frequency is 3 times per week for at least 30 minutes. So this would be the duration, 30 minutes, 3 times per week. And if possible, strive for the high intensity exercises. And if not, then moderate intensity is better than no exercise, of course. We also recommend this flexibility, neuromotor, physical activity training, like balance or agility training 2 to 3 times a week. And you would increase the volume as you go along. Even when you start at low intensities, it's ideal to increase the intensity for the aerobic exercises. This part is author's opinion. The previous two that I mentioned are rather level 1. So meaning RCTs. There are RCTs that show this. At this point, this is what we would recommend.
Yes. One question people often have is about the intensity and how to measure it. And I remember the comments by Bas Bloom, who was saying that for people with Parkinson's, the heart rate may not always be the best way of measuring it, because it is a muscle, it is impacted by the condition. But he was recommending to be able to answer a question being put by someone, but not being able to maintain a discussion. So if you're inside your house on one of those fixed bicycles, the right intensity is that you can answer a couple of questions. Are you joining for dinner? Yes or no? You can't just talk about the movie you watched yesterday for 10 minutes. That would mean that you are under the right level. And one thing that actually Rick Hemlish mentioned to me last time we had him on this webinar was that it's also important perhaps to vary what you do, so that you keep challenging your brain gently. So if you run, it's fine to run, but if you only run for 20 years, you're missing the opportunity to try cycling or maybe swimming if it's advisable. So I think it's important to vary what you do every day if you want to perhaps foster some neuroplasticity as well. I don't know what you think about those 2 points.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's very difficult to quantify in terms of the intensity. And here in the publication that we have here, we wrote the percentage of maximum heart rate as a way of measuring this. But of course, this is not the only way of measuring how intense this exercise could be. The plasticity aspect, I fully agree with, and we have various different ways of, I mean, I mentioned in this little circle that we have not just physical activity that is repetitive, that is really training based. There's also leisurely activities that one can do that's considered physical activity itself. It doesn't necessarily have to be at the highest level of intensity in this sense, but if you're moving, swimming, walking a dog, or doing something else that is different compared to just riding a bike every day, all day in the same position, that's also very helpful.
Thank you very much, Anne. And actually, a question from Dominic, who is basically saying, what is your reaction to the news today? But we had heard that before. I think that UCL talked about the link between Parkinson's and the gut microbiome, which is a topic we had explored before. And he's asking, what do you think that it will mean in terms of treatment? And how quickly can we expect that treatment to be available? And is there anything we can do as patients in the meantime? And I think that the answer is probably we can do things to improve our gut health in the meantime.
Yeah, what I can say when it comes to this as a lifestyle and from intervention for diet is that So the more diverse the microbiome is, the better. When it comes to constipation and that sort of thing, with more fiber you take in, the better. The Mediterranean diet is proven to be better for constipation, for cognition. And I've had an interest myself into the microbiome and the byproducts that come out of it. So these short chain fatty acids, and some of which
Yeah.
have been considered to be protective. And as you know, people think, okay, is it the brain first, or is it the gut first for Parkinson's disease? And some maintain, okay, it's actually starting from the gut where you have pathology in the gut. So maybe there's a direct impact from the microbiome in the gut and how that influences from the vagus nerve to the brain.
Mhm.
Um, at the moment, there is no treatment per se, but I don't know how quickly we could expect treatment to be available. But I can say we're moving in a direction where many people are interested in the microbiome. So
Mhm.
there are mouse models with microbiome and looking into that. There are cellular models even for microbiome research. There are cohorts, many cohorts, some of which I'm also looking into with Bas and with Christine, collecting stool samples and looking into that to look at the diversity of that, how that correlates with the metabolome, how that correlates with effects for L-DOPA or effects for drug use
Yeah.
and in patients. So there's a lot of research that is going on. There are certain microbiota that is popping up quite sometimes quite consistently too. So there's certain bacterial genuses that show up in several different publications, but I cannot comment on how quickly the treatment can come available and that aspect.
One thing I would say is that for anyone wanting to look into this topic further, I'm just looking at my records, and on in September 24, we had Philippe Skebrians, one of the specialists of the gut microbiome that you seem to be knowing quite well,
Yes, yes.
talking to us. So there is a full webinar from him on that topic. And September 24, it's on the YouTube channel. So we have like a lot of very scattergun kind of questions, all very interesting, but actually touching at various themes. So let's just go and look at some of them. Julia is asking whether you would also recommend a daily vitamin D supplement.
Yeah, the supplement diet the supplementary sort of research results are a little bit all over the place. I would say
Mhm.
it's there isn't one supplement that we would say, okay, this is the winning one. There is a cocktail mixture of supplements that people take. So omega-3s, you have vitamin D, you have vitamin C, you have, these cocktail mixtures that show that there might be benefits for cognition. But it's really I cannot say a specific recommendation for
Mhm.
this because we need replication for a lot of these supplementary supplements that people are taking. So it's hard to really say we would recommend that
Yes.
supplement.
It's also very personal. I think it's a combination, in my experience, it's a combination of your own situation. If you want, you need to do the blood test and maybe some hair test, like I've been doing for other kind of aspects. And of course, done by someone, interpreted by someone who is specialist in Parkinson's, because the levels of a standard person may not be the same one as someone with Parkinson's. Now we have actually Suzanne asking about the fact that she heard about a trial using immunosuppressing medications, and she's asking whether it is good to have a strong immune defense system or not, as some trials suggest.
Right. Um, that is not a straightforward answer for inflammation. It's so there are studies where they show, okay, there's a direct influence of the STING pathway increasing IL-6 levels for certain genetic forms of PD. There is inflammation involved, and Parkin-related PD, there's inflammation involved with IL-6 levels, for example.
Mm.
Um, and then of course the opposite would be lowering that. But as you can tell from some of these studies like that I presented on aspirin, aspirin is supposed to be involved in inflammation. What we're not seeing is that even though it's protective for the onset of PD or for maybe PD risk and NSAIDs, these NSAIDs that are anti-inflammatory are supposed to be protective. When we're looking at the motor and non-motor features of patients and people who take aspirin, take these anti-inflammatories, they might have a more even more severe progression of these symptoms.
Mm.
So it's hard to say how that affects a patient. But what we know in cellular models is that this inflammation also occurs. For example, in COVID, during the COVID time, when you have COVID-19 and Parkinson's, they both of these can have a synergistic impact and exacerbate certain symptoms. Some of these publications on PD and COVID have come out. And we also performed a single cell experiments looking into the brains of Parkinson's patients and COVID, because COVID, you have this inflammatory cytokine response, right? So you would then see exacerbated cytokine responses in patients with PD and COVID, and in
Mm.
specific cells, so microglia or astrocytes. So inflammation is definitely happening. Neural inflammation is happening, but to what extent can you suppress that? And at what point and how much of that can actually influence the motor or non-motor features? That's really
Yes.
a question that we cannot answer at this point. All we know right now is that there is inflammation that occurs and that there is a direct link there.
Yes, and we had the pleasure in May last year to listen to Professor Malu Tansi, who is one of the world's renowned specialists in inflammation. So people wanting to dig further into inflammation, you will have there an hour of information on that topic. Mary is asking whether there has been any studies on frequent antibiotic use and the impact it might have on the microbiome, and of course on Parkinson's.
Mm. I can't recall any specific antibiotic use, but what I do know is that what what they had was in mouse models, for example, where they had germ-free mice versus
Mm.
mice with healthy microbiota. The mice with healthy microbiota actually and mutation in one of the Parkinson's genes called alpha-synuclein. Those mice developed Parkinson's disease, but the germ-free mice didn't develop Parkinson's disease, which is very interesting because you have one with healthy microbiota, but with the mutation, they get motor signs and problems, these mice. But then on the other hand, without any microbiota, there are no
Yes,
problems. So it's a big question mark whether or not that would happen.
maybe a good topic for a PhD study
Yeah.
in your group. So Neil is asking us whether there are any common drugs for other conditions that potentially lead to a worse outcome in Parkinson's. I'm thinking, for instance, in my experience of some sleeping tablets that were containing some antihistamine that were, in certain cases, known to be reducing the impact of the medication.
Uh-huh. I'm not an expert in drugs per se,
Mhm.
in pharmacology. Um, so I unfortunately cannot really comment too much on that.
Mhm.
But what we did see for melatonin, for example, in the articles that we've read, the melatonin actually helps with the sleep.
Yes.
But of course, it has some effects on other things too. Nocturia, for example, the urinary consequences of
Mhm.
melatonin. So in this particular context, we didn't really include drugs into
Mhm.
the review. Yeah.
Okay. So Charles is coming back on what you said about keto diet, and he basically says that Dr. Matthew Phillips, who we had here a couple of times in the past, did an RCT 2 years ago, 3 years ago, on a very small sample, admittedly, but basically you focused, Charles says, on the adherence problems of people not sticking to the program.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
a therapeutic keto diet has been used, he says, very successfully for people with epilepsy. So
Mm-hmm.
he also had no adherence issues, Matthew, in his RCT. So beyond the adherence issues, do you think that keto diet could prove to be very useful for people with Parkinson's in creating ketones?
What we are seeing for the ketogenic diet is that there is no direct influence on motor or non-motor symptoms, at least from the results that we're looking at for those papers. The ketogenic diet, when you well, it's more protein based, and then when you have more protein, there are also other studies showing that protein actually stops the or does not help is not helpful for L-DOPA intake or uptake
Mhm.
into the body. So then you have to replace it with whey protein or supplementation. So there's a bit of a conflict there, right? If you have ketogenic
Yes.
diet, you're more protein based. Um, so I actually have a trouble thinking that, okay, right away from the ketogenic diet, you would have symptomatic relief if you are not taking up L-DOPA as well. So there
Yes.
is a bit of a conflict.
I remember actually Matthew Phillips mentioning also not only keto, but also fasting and various types of fasting. So there is a video on that on our channel again. Sorry to bring you back all the time there, but we've covered a lot of ground and more than we can cover in a single answer. Antonius is asking a question. I would probably answer that myself because he basically says he's 61 years old, just like me almost, 20 years with Parkinson's. This is much more than me. So congratulations for your resistance. And he says that he does twice weekly resistance exercises and weightlifting and twice boxing. Is it okay? In my view, I will let you comment on that after that, Joanne, but I think it is more than okay to do
Yeah.
twice weekly resistance exercises and weightlifting and twice boxing. Is probably more than most people on this webinar are doing. So congratulations on you, and you're an example and inspiration.
Yes, I can only echo what you're saying, Michelle, with this. So yeah, keep it up. I think this is wonderful that you're doing that at 61 years old. So and what we're saying, one of the boxes that we had was boxing is that there are several effects for boxing, not just the exercise physical activity aspects, but there's the
Mhm.
social aspects. There's so many different aspects that boxing can actually touch upon. So this is
Yeah.
wonderful.
So we will go now, I'm joking here, in the sin section of our webinar, because Gordon is asking about sexual activity and someone else was asking about red wine. So I don't know. So Iman is asking, is alcohol a complete no-no, or is there a happy medium, given useful effect of alcohol on blood vessels? And Gordon is asking whether there was any study regarding whether sexual activity is good or bad, and is there any evidence of sexual activity resulting in inflammation or stimulation of the brain? Here we go.
What I can comment on is that with PD there's and also L-DOPA treatments is that risky behaviors tend to increase in patients. So, you know, whether it's gambling or sexual activity
Mhm.
or etc. Um, so these aspects tend to be increased, or smoking, or these sorts of risky subs or increased substances, these types of behaviors, and whether or not that is beneficial in the end,
Mhm.
I cannot say. We did not look into sexual activity, but we did look at and we didn't actually review the risky substances
Mhm.
and aspects there either. So cannot fully comment on that, but of course it is one of the physical activities as well, if you would categorize that as
Mhm.
partially including that aspect. So.
I think that actually remembering what some other experts have said over time about wine, and I like my red wine like anyone else, is that if you don't drink alcohol, which is a really quasi situation because I hardly drink anything, if you don't drink alcohol, that was Bas Bloom echoing in this webinar, If you don't drink alcohol, don't start. If you drink alcohol, if you feel you need to drink alcohol, drink moderately red wine. That was the point. As to
I mean,
sexual
he's
activity,
right with that. Yeah,
sex,
exactly.
sexual activity, we never really touch on that. And actually, we're laughing about it like teenagers, but it's quite an important topic. So we have a few more minutes for questions. Let me just see. Yeah, there was an interesting question about stress management and the mindfulness from Susie. She basically says there has been some discussion about the relationship between dealing with trauma and long-term stress having a relationship and positive impact on motor symptoms. So I remember Rick Helmick, who you mentioned yourself earlier, Joanne, has done a presentation on stress a couple of years ago. And he was saying that actually stress does not create or trigger Parkinson. Well, it does not create Parkinson's. You don't get Parkinson's because of stress. But if you're enduring chronic stress in particular, it can uncover an underlying situation that was there already. So you might get it earlier if you want, but you had it already in you. And she's talking about dealing with trauma, something we never discussed, which is basically people who have endured drastic traumas in their lives, even as children. It's almost like spirituality in a sense. So do you have any thoughts on those two things, basically stress management and dealing with trauma through meditation and mindfulness?
Yeah. So like you said, Michelle, that perhaps it's a developmental process for Parkinson's where it's a way of saying that we cannot compensate anymore, and then we develop Parkinson's disease. So
Mm-hmm.
there are ways of compensating mechanistically, and then with stress or with inflammation or with these types or that it uncovers in a sense where the compensation can't happen anymore. It does not happen. We fail to compensate for these things,
Mm-hmm.
and then it unmasks. So then PD unmasks. And with meditation and yoga and mindfulness, these are shown to actually help with mood, to help with anxiety, to help with depression. Perhaps it gets even worse as the trauma uncovers or as the stress uncovers more, that you end up getting depression or anxiety in addition to your PD. And in that sense, the mindfulness can be very effective in reducing these sorts of stress-related
Mm-hmm.
symptoms.
Thank you very much. So we just answer maybe a couple more questions. I know that you have some constraints on your side as well, and I think we've been going for more than an hour. But Sandra says that after 22 years, the medication, I guess the dopamine, is losing its efficacy. So 22 years is really, really impressive. And Sandra says that she's told that her only remaining options are DBS or drug by pump. She's 77.
Mhm.
What can you say to Sandra based on the presentation we had today? Because we're not going to ask you to talk about DBS or the pump in particular necessarily unless you want to, but basically,
Mhm.
how does it echo with what you discussed today?
I mean, 22 years on medication is quite some time, and being 77 is rather on later older end of the spectrum. Of course, with such a long process,
Mm-hmm.
and the medication, the effectiveness of the medication goes down because the medication itself is treating symptoms, right? It doesn't
Yes.
stop the progression of the disease. And what we're trying to find out more and more is how to stop the progression. How do we delay, not delay the onset only, but also delay the progression of the disease. So there are several longitudinal studies here where it showed that pesticides exposure maybe longitudinally or black tea drinking longitudinally um, has an impact. And we don't know about the progression yet, but if
Mm-hmm.
there's a longitudinal impact, there could be still an influence on progression. So in this case, if the medication is not working as effectively, and we expect this as time goes on, and you're using more and more L-DOPA, and you have to increase the dose as you go on because the effectiveness isn't working. What one could do is still use these lifestyle interventions as much as possible to try to delay the progression where you can. We don't have a
Mm-hmm.
direct causal effect of these lifestyle interventions on progression, but there are these studies that show longitudinally
Yes.
that there are effects too.
Thank you very much. I think it is basically a message of hope. In a sense, what you're saying is that it doesn't matter for how long you have been symptomatic. what we're talking about here, the synergetic benefits of using those 6 pillars are still there and probably manifesting themselves in different ways as we are progressing along the journey.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, treatment, a lot of researchers are trying to figure out what the best way
Yes,
is for treatment. And we're trying to research what are the protective effects that we could
yes.
capitalize on. And hoping that one day that we not only have a drug for the symptomatic treatment or
Mhm.
symptomatic problem, but also the actual disease itself, so the progression.
Joanne, thank you so much for your time today. I know it's quite late in Germany already, so I really appreciate your dedication to spending an hour with us in the evening. Thank you
Um,
also for your, generally speaking, the fact that you're supporting our health and helping us find solutions to our condition. And this is your career. So thank you for dedicating your life, if you want, or your professional life at least, to that. And thank you for audience for great questions. On the 27th of April, which is in a week's time, we'll have a new webinar on food as a medicine, and we'll be focusing on neuroinflammation. It's a perfect topic as a follow-up to today. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Joanne. And we will be posting the recording of this webinar probably tomorrow or at the latest the day after. And I appreciate your time, Joanne, and the great questions by our audience. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.